Famous host Ashley Roberts recently surprised many listeners when she announced on radio that Hollywood legend Dick Van Dyke had passed away. In just a few seconds, the name associated with The Dick Van Dyke Show, Mary Poppins, and more than a century of entertainment history suddenly appeared in an obituary report, leaving many people stunned. In this video, we will look back at the lives of artists who have recently passed away. Individuals who touched the hearts of the public through their talent, dedication, and lasting marks on popular culture. This is a moment for us to remember and appreciate the enduring contributions they have left over the years. If you value remembrance content like this, please support the channel by pressing like and subscribing. Thank you for being with us. Now, let's begin. Veteran comedy writer and producer Sandy Wernick, a longtime collaborator of actor Adam Sandler, and a key figure behind many well-known Hollywood comedy films, has died at the age of 86. The news was confirmed on March 3, 2026, after Adam Sandler shared a tribute on social media, and entertainment outlets including Deadline reported the news. Wernick's passing marks the end of the life of a quiet, yet influential figure in the American comedy industry. Sandy Wernick began his career in television and comedy, working as a writer, producer, and content developer. He contributed to many comedy television programs and helped build the foundation for several notable entertainment projects. Behind the scenes in Hollywood, Wernick was known for his ability to recognize talent and for his willingness to support young performers. One of the most important aspects of his career was his long-standing collaboration with Adam Sandler. Wernick was considered one of the first people to believe in Sandler's potential, when the actor was still in the early stage of his career. The two later continued working together on a number of successful film projects. Among the films that Sandy Wernick helped produce were Happy Gilmore, 1996, The Wedding Singer, 1998, Grown Ups, 2010, and Grown Ups 2, 2013. These works helped shape the familiar style of Hollywood comedy for many years. To his colleagues, Sandy Wernick was remembered as a dedicated producer who was always willing to support others. Although he rarely appeared in public, he left a lasting mark on many entertainment projects. Neil Sedaka, the singer and songwriter best known for the classic hit Breaking Up Is Hard to Do, has died at the age of 86. He passed away on February 27, 2026, after being taken to the hospital earlier that same morning. In a statement released to the public, his family expressed deep sorrow over the unexpected loss. Our family is deeply saddened by the sudden passing of our beloved husband, father, and grandfather, Neil Sedaka. He was a true legend of rock and roll, an inspiration to millions, but above all a wonderful human being whom we will forever cherish and miss. Neil Sedaka was born in 1939 in Brooklyn, New York, and grew up in the Brighton Beach neighborhood. From an early age, he showed a strong musical talent. As a teenager, Sedaka met Howard Greenfield, who would later become his key songwriting partner. The two began writing songs together at the Brill Building in New York, the well-known center of pop songwriting at the time. He became widely known to the public in the late 1950s and early 1960s with hit songs such as Oh Carol, Calendar Girl, and Happy Birthday Sweet 16. The song Breaking Up Is Hard to Do later reached #1 on the charts and became one of the defining highlights of his career. In addition to performing, Sedaka also wrote songs for other artists, including the well-known track Stupid Cupid, performed by Connie Francis. In the mid-1960s, when the British invasion pushed many early rock artists off the charts, Sedaka continued writing music. In the early 1970s, after moving to the United Kingdom, he experienced a notable comeback. The song Love Will Keep Us Together, which he wrote, became a #1 hit when performed by Captain and Tennille, and he also co-wrote Ring Ring, one of the first notable songs by ABBA. Over a career spanning several decades, Neil Sedaka released more than 25 studio albums, received 5 Grammy nominations, and was inducted into the Songwriters Hall of Fame in 1983. He is survived by his wife, Liebe Strasberg, and their 2 children, Dara and Mark. American actor Bobby J. Brown, known to audiences for his roles in television series such as The Wire, has passed away at the age of 62. The information was confirmed by authorities following a fire that occurred at a farm on February 24th. According to the official conclusion, the cause of death was extensive thermal injuries and smoke inhalation, and the death was determined to be an accident. The sudden passing of Bobby J. Brown shocked his family and loved ones. His daughter, Raina Brown, said she received the devastating news late at night while she was asleep, after a call informing her that her father had not survived the fire. For the family, this is a great loss, bringing to a close the life of a father, a husband, and a dedicated artist. Born and raised in Washington, D.C., Bobby J. Brown initially built a career in amateur boxing, winning 5 Golden Gloves titles. He later decided to change direction toward the arts and moved to New York to study at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, where the foundation for his acting career was formed. After graduating, he appeared in many notable television projects, such as Law and Order, Special Victims Unit, Homicide, Life on the Street, The Corner, The Wire, and We Own This City. In addition to acting, Brown also directed documentary films such as Off the Chain and Tear the Roof Off. In the eyes of his colleagues, Bobby J. Brown was a disciplined artist dedicated to his craft. Although he was not a loud Hollywood star, he still left a lasting mark through memorable performances. American guitarist Travis Wammack, who first drew attention when the instrumental song Scratchy entered the American music charts when he was only 17 years old, an important figure of Southern American music and a musician who contributed to many hit recordings across the genres of rock, R&B, and country, has passed away at the age of 81. The information was confirmed after Travis Wammack died on February 27, 2026, closing a journey of nearly 7 decades connected with the stage and recording studios. Travis Wammack was born in 1944 in Walnut, Mississippi, and showed talent with the guitar from a very young age. At only 11 years old, he released his first recording. By 1964, when he was just 17, the instrumental song Scratchy entered the American music charts, helping his name become known in the rock and roll scene. In the years that followed, Wammack became a prominent session guitarist in the Muscle Shoals, Alabama region, a place that produced many famous recordings in American music. He worked at renowned studios such as Fame Studios, contributing to the sound of many recordings in the soul, rock, and country genres. His guitar style was highly regarded for its strength and creativity. In addition to studio work, Wammack also released albums such as Travis Wammack, 1972, and Not for Sale, 1975, and he also served as the band leader for Little Richard for many years. He received the Professional Musician Award from the Alabama Music Hall of Fame and was honored at the Rockabilly Hall of Fame. The legacy of Travis Wammack continues to resonate in many well-known recordings of American music. Actor Robert Carradine, a familiar face to audiences through the series Lizzie McGuire, passed away on February 23, 2026, at the age of 71. The information was confirmed by his family to American media, including Page 6 and several major news outlets. According to a statement from the family, he passed away after a long period of facing depression, a condition he had quietly treated for many years. Robert Reed Carradine was born in 1954 in Los Angeles into a family with a strong artistic tradition. He was the son of veteran actor John Carradine and the younger brother of Keith and David Carradine. Entering the film industry in the early 1970s, he soon appeared in films such as The Cowboys and Mean Streets. Carradine became widely known for his role as Louis Skolnick in the 1980s comedy film series Revenge of the Nerds, a work considered iconic within the American youth comedy genre. For a younger generation of viewers, Robert Carradine was closely associated with the role of Sam McGuire, the kind-hearted father in the Disney Channel series Lizzie McGuire, which aired from 2001 to 2004. This role brought him special affection from audiences around the world. With a calm and approachable demeanor, he portrayed the image of a warm father on the small screen. Over more than 5 decades of activity, Robert Carradine participated in numerous film and television projects. Colleagues regarded him as a dedicated and persistent artist. For many viewers, he was not only a familiar actor, but also a part of their childhood memories. Model and Annabelle Schofield, a face who once appeared in the film Desperately Seeking Susan, has passed away at the age of 62. According to confirmation from her family to the media, she died on February 20th at her home in the state of New Mexico after a period of battling cancer. Her passing closes the life of an artist who once left her mark in the fashion and film industries of the 1980s. Annabelle Schofield was born in the United Kingdom and entered the international fashion world at an early age. In the 1980s, she became known as a prominent model, appearing in many advertising campaigns and fashion publications. With a natural style and a distinct personality, Schofield became a familiar face in the fashion scene of that era. After establishing her name in the modeling industry, she moved into acting and participated in several film projects. Schofield is remembered by many audiences for her appearance in the film Desperately Seeking Susan, 1985, a production that starred Madonna and Rosanna Arquette. The film later became a notable mark of popular culture in the 1980s. After her period of activity in the entertainment industry, Schofield gradually stepped away from the spotlight and moved to New Mexico, where she focused on family life and personal creative activities. In the eyes of friends and loved ones, Annabelle Schofield is remembered as a warm woman, full of energy, and someone who always maintained her love for the arts. Before the name Dick Van Dyke appeared on screen, before the lights of Broadway or the rooftops of London in Mary Poppins, his story began in a place that almost no one noticed on the map of the United States, West Plains, Missouri, the year 1925. It was not the place where people would expect an entertainment icon of the 20th century to be born. Dick Van Dyke, whose birth name was Richard Wayne Van Dyke, was born on December 13, 1925, exactly at the time when the United States was moving deeper into the Great Depression. The middle class was shrinking rapidly, and many families lived frugally from year to year. The towns of the Midwest carried the familiar atmosphere of that period, calm, hard-working, and sometimes heavy. The Van Dyke family existed within that same context. His father, Loren Wayne Van Dyke, often called by the nickname Cookie, was a traveling salesman for the Sunshine Cookie Company. His job was tied to long trips through small towns. He drove along dusty roads, stopping at grocery stores to sell cookies and look for orders. Some trips lasted for weeks, leaving the house most of the time, with only his mother and the two brothers. His mother, Hazel Victoria Van Dyke, worked as a stenographer, a typing secretary. She was a serious person with deep religious faith. In her side of the family, church was not only a place to go on Sundays, it was the center of community life, a system of values that shaped how people understood the world. Not long after Dick was born, the family moved to Danville, Illinois, a small town with about 30,000 residents. This was the place that truly shaped his childhood. Danville was the kind of town where everyone knew each other's names, knew each other's families, and where almost nothing happened without the whole community knowing about it. Church gatherings, small performances at the high school, familiar streets, all of it created an environment that was both narrow and safe. Many years later, Dick Van Dyke remembered the place with a simple remark. Danville was a place where almost all 30,000 people felt like they were related to each other. His family was not wealthy. They lived with difficulty, like many American families during the Great Depression. But looking back, he once said something remarkable. He and his younger brother Jerry Van Dyke, who was 6 years younger than him, grew up during that period without ever realizing that they were poor. In his memory, childhood was not associated with scarcity, it was associated with laughter. The two brothers often created silly games around the house. Even when money was limited, they still found ways to entertain themselves. Small stories, playful jokes, moments that made the whole family laugh. Those existed more often than any sense of hardship. Later, Jerry Van Dyke would also become a well-known actor with the sitcom Coach. But during the years in Danville, they were simply two boys growing up in a house where humor became a way of living. What is interesting is that Danville at that time seemed to concentrate a surprisingly large number of artistic talents. Among Dick Van Dyke's schoolmates was Donald O'Connor, who would later become the star of Singing in the Rain. Another was Bobby Short, a famous cabaret performer. And among his childhood friends, there was even a relative of Gene Hackman, the actor who would later win an Academy Award. A small town, a small generation. Yet it produced more artists than anyone might have expected. At the center of all of that was a thin boy, long-limbed, always moving more than necessary. Making other people laugh seemed to come naturally to him. At that time, no one knew where that would lead. Not his family, not the town of Danville, and certainly not the boy himself. There are very small moments in youth that seem almost unnoticeable at the time, yet later become turning points for an entire life. For Dick Van Dyke, that moment happened in a drama class at his high school in Danville, Illinois. Before that, the path he imagined for himself was completely different. Growing up in a family with strong faith, where the church held a central role in community life, Dick once seriously considered becoming a minister. Not out of obligation, but because he felt it was a way to connect with people, to say something meaningful to them. The idea came to him very naturally. In the religious atmosphere of his mother's family, it was a respectable and reasonable choice. But then he stepped into the high school drama class, and almost immediately, everything changed. On the small stage of the school, in front of rows of familiar audience seats, Dick Van Dyke felt for the first time something he would later mention often: the feeling of a room responding to him. When a line, a gesture, a perfectly timed pause makes people laugh or sit quietly and listen. That energy, that instant connection, made him realize that he wanted to stand there longer. Many years later, he looked back and said that his career in entertainment, in a way, was simply another form of his original mission. He was still doing what he once wanted to do when he thought about becoming a minister, touching the spirit of people, lifting them slightly above whatever they faced each day. Only the pulpit had been replaced by a stage, but before any large stage appeared, history stepped into his life. In 1944, when Dick Van Dyke was in his senior year of high school, World War II was at its peak. Like many American young men of his generation, he decided to enlist. He joined the United States Army Air Forces with the hope of becoming a pilot. That plan did not become reality. His application for pilot training was rejected. Instead, the military assigned him lighter duties, and, in an arrangement that was almost ironic, part of his work involved something he was just beginning to discover: performing. Even within the disciplined environment of the military, Dick Van Dyke was still placed on stage. He took part in performances for soldiers, presenting short comedy acts and small theatrical sketches to entertain men living in the middle of war. There, he learned something important. When soldiers were exhausted from training, when they were worried about what lay ahead, a few minutes of laughter could change the atmosphere of an entire room. It did not solve the war, but it helped people breathe a little easier. Dick Van Dyke realized that what he was doing was not small. He had the ability to make people laugh, and in certain circumstances, that truly had value. The war ended in 1945. Dick Van Dyke left the military and returned to Danville. But this time, he was no longer the teenager who had only been experimenting with a few small roles in school. He had stood in front of an audience. He had seen how a room could change when laughter appeared. And even though the road ahead was still completely uncertain, one thing had become clearer than ever. He wanted to keep doing it. Stage lights usually shine only on the brightest years of an artist's life. But before that happens, there is always a long period but almost no one sees. A quiet phase, where talent is refined among small jobs, long trips, and very little certainty about the future. For Dick Van Dyke, that period began after 1945, when World War II ended and he returned to Danville, Illinois. America was entering a new era, but in mass media, radio was still the dominant medium. Television had appeared, but it was still moving very slowly, and it was in that world of radio waves that Dick Van Dyke found his first steps. He worked at WDAN radio station in Danville as a part-time radio host. The job did not bring fame, but it brought something more important: experience. In front of the microphone, he learned how to hold the audience's attention using only his voice, rhythm, pauses, and the precise timing of a joke. Those seemingly small skills gradually became the foundation of his later performing style. During this period, he met Phil Erickson, a pantomime artist who specialized in silent performance. That meeting led to a rather unusual idea in the late 1940s. The two formed a duo called Eric and Van, the Merry Mutes. Their act was silent comedy, performed to popular songs of the time. In an era when talking films had already dominated, returning to wordless performance seemed to go against the trend. But it was precisely that difference that caught the audience's attention. The two young performers loaded their luggage into a car and began touring across the United States. They performed at nightclubs and hotels around Los Angeles, then continued to Atlanta, Georgia, where they became a regular act at the Henry Grady Hotel. Small stages, modest halls, but each performance helped Dick Van Dyke understand more clearly the rhythm of audience reactions. A significant step forward came when the Merry Mutes appeared on the national television program Toast of the Town, hosted by Ed Sullivan, one of the largest entertainment shows in America at that time. For two young performers traveling across the country with a silent comedy act and almost no money, it was an important milestone. After some time, the duo broke up. Dick Van Dyke continued on his own. He moved to New Orleans and worked for WDSU-TV, where he performed a 10-minute comedy segment every day, essentially his first television show of his own. The job required flexibility, writing quickly, performing continuously, and keeping the audience interested every day. By 1954, he made his first appearance on national network television when he participated in the game show Chance of a Lifetime on ABC, alongside host Dennis James. It was only a small step in the timeline of his career, but it was a sign that he was gradually moving beyond the boundaries of local stages. While his career was still uncertain, his personal life also began to take shape. Dick Van Dyke had known Margie Willett, a girl from Danville, for many years. They wanted to get married, but at that time, money was simply something they did not have. The solution came in a rather unusual way. A radio producer offered to pay the entire cost of the wedding rings, and the honeymoon if they agreed to hold the wedding live on air on the program Bride and Groom. And so, on February 12, 1948, in front of a minister and two microphones, Dick Van Dyke and Margie Willett were married, while about 15 million Americans were listening on the radio. Even after the wedding, their life was still very difficult. For a time, the couple had to live in their own car. No house, no financial reserve. There were only the next trips, the next performances, and the persistent belief that somewhere ahead, a greater opportunity was waiting. After many years working on small stages, in radio studios, and in little-known television programs, Dick Van Dyke finally set foot in the place many performers dream of, Broadway. It was not a sudden leap, but the result of nearly a decade of persistent work, one small role at a time, one performance under modest lights after another. And when the real opportunity finally appeared in the late 1950s, things began to change quickly. His first Broadway role came in 1959 with the play The Girls Against the Boys. The production did not create a sensation, but it placed Dick Van Dyke into the professional orbit of the American stage. Just 1 year later, the real breakthrough arrived. In 1960, he was cast as Albert F. Peterson in the musical Bye Bye Birdie. The work was a satirical comedy about the rock and roll craze and teenage fan hysteria, a very fresh subject at the time. The show quickly became a major success on Broadway. Bye Bye Birdie won 4 Tony Awards, including Best Musical, and Dick Van Dyke received the Tony Award for Best Featured Actor in a Musical. After nearly 10 years of quiet work, he was recognized on a national scale for the first time. But Broadway was only the beginning. The real turning point came from television. In 1961, CBS aired the first episode of The Dick Van Dyke Show, a program created by Carl Reiner. Reiner originally intended to play the lead role himself, but the television network wanted a different face. He chose Dick Van Dyke, a decision later considered one of the most important casting choices in the history of American television. In the series, Van Dyke played Rob Petrie, a comedy writer working for a fictional television program while trying to balance his professional life and family life. From the opening sequence, audiences recognized his unique style. Rob Petrie walks into the living room, trips over an ottoman, nearly falls, then regains his balance with a self-mocking smile. A small moment, but one that later became an iconic image of American television. Alongside him was Mary Tyler Moore, then only 24 years old, playing Laura Petrie. The two actors quickly became one of the most beloved married couples on television. The Dick Van Dyke Show ran for 5 seasons with 158 episodes. During its broadcast run, the program won 15 Emmy Awards, and Dick Van Dyke himself received 3 Emmy Awards for Best Actor in a Comedy Series. While the series was at its peak, he also expanded into film. In 1964, Walt Disney invited him to join the film Mary Poppins. Van Dyke played Bert, a London street performer, a chimney sweep, sidewalk chalk artist and musician. He starred alongside Julie Andrews in her first film role. The film received 13 Oscar nominations and won 5 Academy Awards, becoming one of the most beloved family films in cinema history. In the film, Van Dyke also portrayed Mr. Dawes Sr., the elderly chairman of the bank. The role was credited under the name Navkid Keed, an anagram of Dick Van Dyke. 4 years later, he continued starring in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, 1968, playing the eccentric inventor Caractacus Potts in the film based on a story by Ian Fleming, the author of the James Bond novels. Also in 1968, Dick Van Dyke received an unexpected offer. Producer Albert Broccoli approached him to discuss the possibility of replacing Sean Connery as James Bond. Van Dyke declined. His reason was very simple. He asked Broccoli, "Have you heard my English accent?" He was referring to the Cockney accent he had attempted in Mary Poppins, an English accent famously known for being not very accurate. That self-awareness and ability to laugh at himself, even after becoming a major star, has always been an inseparable part of who Dick Van Dyke is. For audiences, Dick Van Dyke often appears with a gentle smile, agile dance steps, and a very natural sense of joy. But behind that familiar image is a part of his life that is rarely seen. Years in which success and hardship existed side by side. One of his greatest challenges was alcohol. In the early years of his career, Dick Van Dyke hardly drank alcohol. But as fame arrived, along with parties and the characteristic rhythm of Hollywood life, that habit gradually formed. According to what he later recounted, everything happened very slowly, to the point that he did not realize when social drinking had become a real problem. He drank heavily for about 7 years. By 1972, Dick Van Dyke decided to confront the situation directly. He voluntarily entered a hospital for treatment for 3 weeks. At that time, it was still rare for a famous actor to publicly acknowledge having a problem with alcohol. 2 years later, on The Dick Cavett Show in 1974, he spoke openly about his experience. Van Dyke called alcoholism a physical disease, not a sign of weakness or lack of willpower. After that period of treatment, he did not return to alcohol again. However, another habit proved far more difficult to give up: cigarettes. Dick Van Dyke smoked for many years, and he himself admitted that quitting smoking was harder than quitting alcohol. In a 2013 interview, he said he had used nicotine gum as a substitute for 10 years to quit smoking. By 2023, he still said that nicotine gum remained a familiar part of his daily routine. Those many years of smoking also left traces on his health. Around 2006, Dick Van Dyke began experiencing a strange symptom. Whenever he lay down, he heard a strong pounding sound in his head, like a knocking rhythm inside his skull. Medical tests all returned normal results, which caused the condition to continue for many years. By 2013, the symptom became severe enough that he had to cancel a trip to New York to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award due to insomnia and exhaustion. Later, the cause was discovered quite unexpectedly: titanium implants in his teeth. These metal components created vibrations when he lay down, transmitting through the jawbone and producing a sound like pounding in his head. Once the issue was identified, the symptom disappeared. Yet, the challenges in Dick Van Dyke's life did not come only from health. He married Margie Willett in 1948, and the two had 4 children: Christian, Barry, Stacy, and Carrie Beth. They went through many of the difficult early years of his career together. However, over time, distance gradually appeared, and the marriage ended in divorce in 1984. In the years that followed, Dick Van Dyke lived with Michelle Triola, who had once worked as a secretary for his agent. The two were together for more than 30 years, but never married. In 2009, Michelle Triola passed away from lung cancer. Losses within the family also came over time. His former wife, Margie Willett, passed away in 2008 from pancreatic cancer. His brother, Jerry Van Dyke, also a well-known actor, passed away in 2018 at the age of 82 from heart failure. Earlier, the family had also experienced a tragedy when Jessica Van Dyke, his niece, passed away in 1987 at the age of 13 due to complications of Ray's syndrome after contracting chickenpox. These stories rarely appear on screen, but they are an inseparable part of the life of the man whom audiences are accustomed to seeing with a smile and light steps on stage. Some love stories begin very early in a person's life, but there are also other stories, quieter, more unexpected, that only appear when someone has already passed through almost their entire life. For Dick Van Dyke, that story began in 2006. That year at the SAG Awards, he met Arlene Silver, a makeup artist working behind the scenes. The first meeting was quite simple, just a short conversation during a crowded event. But over time, they began to meet again more often, and the relationship gradually became closer. The difference between them was very clear. Arlene Silver was 46 years younger than Dick Van Dyke. That gap surprised many people when their story was mentioned later. But for the two of them, it did not seem to be a problem. After many years together, Dick Van Dyke and Arlene Silver decided to marry on February 29, 2012. At that time, he was 86 years old. They chose Leap Day, a day that appears only once every 4 years. A small detail, but one that also carried Van Dyke's very characteristic sense of humor. When asked about the age difference between them, he answered with a very simple sentence: "Love doesn't ask for permission and doesn't check identification." This marriage opened a new chapter in the life of Dick Van Dyke, a chapter that took place when many people of his generation had long stepped away from the spotlight. What surprised many people was not only that he married at the age of 86, but also the way he continued to live afterward. In his 90s, Dick Van Dyke still maintained an active lifestyle. He still sang with the a cappella group The Fantastics, participating in small performances that brought him the familiar joy of standing in front of an audience. Besides music, he also spent time painting, a creative hobby he had maintained for many years. And what surprised many people even more was that he still went to the gym regularly, treating physical exercise as an important part of life. In 2015, Dick Van Dyke published the book Keep Moving. Instead of only recounting the past, the book shared his very practical thoughts about aging, health, and how to remain active as time passes. In it, he summarized his philosophy of life in one simple sentence: "The body will follow the mind." For Dick Van Dyke, age was not a clear boundary. It was more like a process that people could adapt to, as long as they kept their curiosity, their movement, and a little humor. At an age when many people had long stopped, he continued to move. Keep moving. For Dick Van Dyke, it was not just advice, it was the way he lived. There are milestones in a person's life that carry special meaning on their own. But 100 years is a number that rarely appears in the life of an artist, especially one who is still present in public life, still speaking, still laughing, still standing before audiences. On December 13th, 2025, Dick Van Dyke turned 100 years old. For many people, it was not simply a birthday. It was a moment to look back at a century that had passed, from the small streets of Danville, Illinois, through the stages of Broadway, through the golden age of American television, and through decades of cinema. Even in that same year, Dick Van Dyke still appeared in new projects. He took part in Coldplay's music video, All My Love, a brief but meaningful appearance where the image of an artist who had lived through nearly a century was placed alongside the music of the current generation. Not long before that, at the age of 98, he still stepped onto the stage to receive a Daytime Emmy Award, becoming the oldest recipient in the history of the award. Dick Van Dyke's 100th birthday was also marked by several special events. A documentary titled Dick Van Dyke, 100th Celebration, was produced to look back at his journey. At the same time, PBS's American Masters program also broadcast a special episode honoring his life and career. But the moment many people remember most happened during a rather simple gathering. At the celebration, Dick Van Dyke stood among friends and family, and he began to sing one of the familiar songs from his career, Let's Go Fly a Kite, the song from the 1964 film Mary Poppins. A song that has existed for more than half a century, and a voice that was still ringing out at the age of 100. During this same period, Dick Van Dyke continued sharing his thoughts about age and life. He introduced the book 100 Rules for Living to 100. His philosophy is not complicated, just very simple things. Love more, do the things you enjoy, and do not forget to laugh. What surprised many people was not only those words, but the way he truly lived by them. Recently, during the Breakfast Show program, host Ashley Roberts accidentally announced that Dick Van Dyke had passed away while reading a sad news item, but fortunately, it was only a mistake. The error was quickly corrected on air by her colleague Jamie Theakston, who confirmed that the legendary actor was still alive and completely healthy. Roberts then immediately apologized to the audience for the incident during the live broadcast. At the age of 100, Dick Van Dyke still maintains going to the gym 3 times a week. He still practices yoga, and he can still bend down and touch his toes. A small detail, but one that says a great deal about how he takes care of his body. Of course, time still carries its challenges. In 2024, when the Malibu wildfires spread, Dick Van Dyke was forced to leave his home to ensure safety. In that emergency situation, a neighbor had to carry him out of the house. A very ordinary moment, but one that also shows that even after living through a century, life still continues to present unexpected situations. After all those years, Dick Van Dyke still keeps a very particular view of time. In an interview with ABC News, when asked how it felt to turn 100, he answered with a short sentence: 100 years is not enough. Perhaps that is the best way to understand Dick Van Dyke, a man who has lived through a century and still feels that life holds many things worth continuing.